October 15th, 2024. Tyler Cain had been on Chuck Harrison's set for exactly 3 hours when he decided to destroy a man's life over $7,000. The kid stood in front of 40 crew members and called veteran director Frank Russo a washed-up nobody begging for scraps. Chuck watched from the shadows as Frank's face crumpled. 30-year veteran, Purple Heart recipient. The man who directed Chuck's first 3 hits. That's when Tyler pulled out his phone. Not to record the humiliation, to show Chuck something that made his blood freeze. A piece of stunt footage from 1994. The night Bobby Castellano died. The night Chuck Harrison let it happen. Tyler Cain wasn't just some cocky actor. He was Bobby's boy. And he'd been planning this moment for 30 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Chuck Harrison's knees nearly buckled as Tyler's phone screen caught the harsh set lights. Even from 15 feet away, he could see Bobby's silhouette falling through the warehouse rafters, arms windmilling uselessly against gravity. The same footage Chuck had paid 3 people to bury. The same footage that should have been destroyed in a studio fire 2 decades ago. Tyler's smile was razor thin as he pocketed the phone. "Mr. Harrison? I think we need to discuss my contract revision." The set had gone morgue quiet. 40 pairs of eyes bounced between Frank Russo, still red-faced and trembling, and the 25-year-old actor who just nuclear bombed one of Hollywood's most respected directors over what amounted to lunch money for a star of Chuck's caliber. "Everyone take 30, Chuck called out, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. "Frank, my trailer. Now." As the crew dispersed in nervous clusters, Chuck caught sight of Sarah Chen, his longtime assistant director, helping Frank toward the craft services table. The old man's hands were shaking as he reached for a coffee cup. Sarah shot Chuck a look that could have stripped paint. She'd worked with Frank for 8 years, considered him a mentor. "Tyler." Chuck's voice carried the authority of 3 decades in the business. "Walk with me." They moved toward Chuck's trailer, past the elaborate prison set that would serve as the backdrop for Blood Brothers, his latest attempt to prove he could still carry a franchise. The irony wasn't lost on him. $40 million to make a movie about redemption, while his own past was about to drag him into hell. Tyler matched his pace, hands casually tucked in his designer jeans. Beautiful set, must have cost a fortune. Though I suppose when you've got 30 years of hit movies behind you, $7,000 here or there doesn't matter much. Kid, you just humiliated a man who's forgotten more about filmmaking than you'll ever know. Over what? A rounding error? "Oh, this isn't about the money." Tyler's grin widened, though Frank's reaction was educational. "I wanted to see what loyalty looked like on your sets, what protection you offer the people who trust you." They reached Chuck's trailer, a custom 40-footer that had been his mobile office since 1998. Chuck's hand hesitated on the door handle. Once they were inside, this conversation would become real. The careful distance he'd maintained from that night in 1994 would collapse. The trailer's interior reflected Chuck's methodical nature. Scripts organized by project phase, walls lined with photos from 30 years of film sets, a small wet bar that hadn't been touched since he'd gotten sober in 2009. Tyler ran his fingers along the photos, pausing at one from the set O Furban Thunder, Chuck's breakout film, the one that had made him a household name. 1994, Tyler said softly. "You look young here. Hungry." Bobby Castellano did the stunts for this one, didn't he? Chuck moved to his desk, kneading something solid beneath his palms. "What do you want?" "I want to understand something." Tyler turned, and for the first time, Chuck saw past the Hollywood polish to something raw underneath. "I want to understand how a man builds an empire on watching his stunt double die, how he sleeps at night, how he stands in front of crews like the one out there and talks about loyalty and family when he let Bobby Castellano fall because he was too much of a coward to do his own stunts." The trailer's air conditioning cycled on, filling the silence with mechanical white noise. Chuck had imagined this conversation countless times over 3 decades. In his nightmares, in therapy sessions he'd never actually attended, in the small hours when sobriety left him nowhere to hide from his memories. Bobby's death was investigated, ruled an equipment failure. by investigators you paid, using reports you doctored. I've spent 15 years tracking down every piece of evidence, Chuck. Every witness. Every document. Tyler's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I know you loosened those safety cables yourself. Jesus Christ. The words escaped before Chuck could stop them. You're really Bobby's boy, Robert Tyler Castellano Kane. I took my stepfather's name when Mom remarried, but yeah, I'm Bobby's boy. And I've been planning this conversation since I was 10 years old and figured out why Daddy never came home. Through the trailer's window, Chuck could see his crew reassembling. Sarah was setting up the next shot while Frank stood apart, still looking shell-shocked. These people depended on him, not just for paychecks, but for something larger. The belief that someone in this business still gave a damn about craft over profit, loyalty over convenience. Tyler followed his gaze. They have no idea, do they, that their fearless leader is built on a foundation of bones. Chuck turned back to face his accuser. Bobby's son, the ghost he'd never expected to take human form. What do you want? Tyler's smile returned, cold and patient. Everything. The word hung in the trailer's recycled air like smoke from an old fire. Everything. Chuck's fingers found the edge of his desk, gripping until his knuckles went white. Through the thin walls, he could hear the familiar sounds of a film set in motion. Sarah's voice coordinating the lighting crew, the rumble of equipment being repositioned, the low murmur of conversations that would stop the moment he stepped back outside. Everything's a big word, kid. Tyler moved to the small leather couch where Chuck had spent countless hours reviewing dailies, making the decisions that had built Harrison Entertainment into a minor empire. The young man settled back with the casual confidence of someone who held all the cards. I've had 15 years to think about what justice looks like. Tyler's fingers traced the arm of the couch. At first, I wanted you dead. Simple revenge. But then I realized something better, watching you lose everything the way my family did, piece by piece. Chuck studied Bobby's son, searching for traces of the man who died in his place. Bobby had been compact and wiry, with calloused hands and laugh lines that came from spending most of his life 50 feet in the air. Tyler was taller, broader, with a kind of manufactured perfection that came from personal trainers and careful grooming. But the eyes were the same, dark brown, intense, missing nothing. Your father was a good man, Chuck said quietly. Better than me. Don't. The word came out sharp enough to cut. Don't you dare talk about him like you cared. You used him. You let him take risks that should have been yours because you were too scared to do the job yourself. The accusation hit home because it was true. Chuck had been 28 when Urban Thunder started filming, already successful enough to demand a stunt double but young enough that the studio still expected him to do some of his own action work. The warehouse sequence had been particularly brutal, a 50-foot fall onto carefully positioned airbags. Industry standard safety. But Chuck had looked down from that platform and frozen. The cables were fine when Bobby checked them, Chuck said, the lie he'd told himself for 3 decades. Equipment fails. It happens. The cables were fine until you got to them. Tyler pulled out his phone, swiped to a new video. This is security footage from the warehouse. Took me 12 years to track down the original. The studio kept copies in off-site storage. Amazing what people forget about when they're covering their asses. He didn't play the video, but Chuck could see the timestamp, 11:47 p.m., October 15, 1994. An hour before Bobby's final run. You want to see what you look like, sawing through safety cables? Or should I just describe the expression on your face while you condemned a better man to die for your career? Chuck's chest felt tight, the way it had during his brief heart scare in 2018. Sarah had driven him to Cedars-Sinai herself, staying in the waiting room while they ran tests. When the results came back negative, stress, not cardiac failure, she'd looked at him with the kind of concern usually reserved for family. These people depended on him. My crew, Chuck said. Sarah, Frank, the grips and gaffers and camera operators out there, they've got nothing to do with this. Whatever you want from me, leave them out of it. Tyler's smile returned, predatory and patient. But that's the beautiful part, Chuck. They're not separate from this. They're the point. You've spent 30 years building a reputation as the guy who takes care of his people, the producer who remembers birthdays and pays for medical bills and treats his crew like family. It's very touching. Through the window, Chuck could see Danny Martinez adjusting a light rig. Danny had been Chuck's gaffer for 12 years, ever since his kid had been diagnosed with leukemia, and Chuck had quietly covered the medical bills that insurance wouldn't touch. The kid was in college now, studying film production. What happens when they find out their father figure is a murderer? Tyler continued. When every trade publication in town runs the story of how Chuck Harrison built his empire on Bobby Castellano's corpse, think Sarah will still bring you coffee and call you boss, with that little smile? The trailer's walls seemed to contract. Chuck had always been claustrophobic, another reason he'd used doubles for confined space sequences, but this felt different, suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with physical space. You want money? Chuck asked. I've got money. You want a career? I can make calls. I want you to feel what my mother felt when the cops showed up at our apartment. I want you to understand what it's like to lose everything that matters while everyone you trusted watches it happen. Tyler stood, smoothing his designer jacket. But first, I want you to finish your movie. Make it good, Chuck. Make it something you can be proud of. Because it's going to be your last. The young man moved toward the trailer door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Oh, and Chuck, keep treating your crew well. I want them to love you right up until the moment I destroy you. The trailer door clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Chuck remained frozen at his desk, staring at the space Tyler had occupied, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. 30 years of careful construction, his reputation, his relationships, his empire, balanced on the edge of a knife held by a dead man's son. His hands were shaking. When had that started? A sharp knock on the door made him jump. Chuck? Sarah's voice carried concern and barely controlled anger. We need to talk about what just happened out there. Give me a minute, he called back, his voice rougher than intended. Frank's talking about walking. Half the crew thinks Tyler's some kind of psychopath, and the other half thinks you're going to fire them for witnessing it. So no, I'm not giving you a minute. Chuck moved toward the door, pausing to catch his reflection in the small mirror beside it. The face looking back belonged to a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, older than his 58 years. When had he started looking like a man with secrets? He opened the door to find Sarah waiting with her arms crossed, tablet clutched against her chest like armor. Behind her, the set had the nervous energy of a bomb scene. Crew members clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices while stealing glances toward his trailer. Inside, he said. Sarah stepped past him, immediately claiming the space Tyler had vacated on the couch. She'd been his assistant director for 8 years, working her way up from script supervisor on Desert Storm, his last major action franchise. Somewhere along the way, she'd become the closest thing to family he had in this business. Want to explain what the hell that was about? She asked. Chuck closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly exhausted. Tyler's got some kind of grudge. I'm handling it. Bullshit. Sarah's voice cut through his deflection like a blade. Nobody humiliates Frank Russo over $7,000 unless they're playing a much bigger game. And the way you looked when Tyler showed you that phone? Chuck, I've never seen you scared before. It was terrifying. Scared. Such a simple word for the complex horror currently eating him alive. Chuck moved to his desk, shuffling through script pages that no longer seemed to matter. Tyler was right about one thing. This would be his last film, whether he finished it or not. There are things in my past, Chuck began, then stopped. How do you confess to murder? How do you tell someone who trusts you that everything they believe about you is built on a lie? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying him with the analytical eye that made her exceptional at her job. This is about Bobby Castellano, isn't it? Chuck's blood turned to ice water. What? I did my research when I started working for you. Read everything about your early career. Watched your old films. Bobby was your stunt double on Urban Thunder. Died in that warehouse accident. She paused. Tyler looks like him. Same bone structure, same eyes. I noticed it the moment he walked on set. The script pages slipped from Chuck's fingers, scattering across the desk. Sarah knew. Had always known or suspected or seen something he'd thought was buried. Sarah. I also know that Bobby's death made your career, she continued, her voice gentler now. Urban Thunder became a massive hit partly because of the tragedy. The studio marketed your grief, your determination to finish the film in Bobby's honor. It was brilliant PR. Cuck felt something crack inside his chest, not his heart, something deeper. The careful wall he'd built between his public self and his private guilt. You think I killed him. I think you've been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and I think Tyler Kane isn't who he claims to be. Sarah leaned forward. The question is, what does he want, and how do we stop him? Or we? Even now, even with suspicion hanging between them like smoke, Sarah was still thinking in terms of loyalty, partnership. The kind of trust Cuck had spent 3 decades earning and Tyler would destroy in a single press release. His phone buzzed against the desk. A text from an unknown number. Check your email. Tyler. Chuck's laptop was already open, browser displaying his production company's inbox. A new message sat at the top, sent from a generic Gmail account for your review. The attachment was a video file labeled Warehouse Security 10.1594 full.movie. Don't, Sarah said, but Cuck had already clicked play. The grainy footage showed the warehouse interior, timestamp glowing in the corner, 11:47 p.m. Cuck watched himself climb the rigging like a man possessed, wire cutters glinting in the work lights. He remembered that night, the panic, the desperate calculation, the terrible moment when self-preservation overwhelmed everything decent in him. On screen, his younger self methodically weakened the safety cables, leaving them functional enough to pass Bobby's initial inspection but guaranteed to fail under stress. Premeditated, calculated, murder. Jesus Christ, Sarah whispered. Cuck closed the laptop. His old life was officially over. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Sarah stared at the closed laptop, her face cycling through expressions Cuck had never seen before. Shock, disgust, calculation. He watched 30 years of trust crumble in real time, each passing second another nail in the coffin of everything he'd built. How long? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Since it happened. Since that night. No. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the set. How long have you known Tyler was Bobby's son? Chuck's mind felt sluggish, like he was thinking through molasses. Today, just now when he told me. Bullshit. She spun around, her usual composure completely gone. You don't cast an unknown actor in a $40 million film without running background checks. You don't let someone waltz onto your set and destroy Frank without knowing exactly who they are. The accusation stung because it was almost true. Cuck had built his reputation on control, on knowing every variable before they became problems. But Tyler had slipped through somehow, presented credentials that passed every check, charmed everyone who mattered. I didn't know, Cuck repeated, but even he could hear how weak it sounded. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the crew through the window. Danny was directing a group of grips repositioning the prison set's bars, his movements efficient and confident. These people had families, mortgages, careers that depended on Harrison Entertainment's continued success. The Castellano boy disappeared after Bobby's funeral, Sarah said without turning around. I remember reading about it in the trade papers. Mother took him somewhere, changed their names. Studio paid for grief counseling, relocation expenses. Very generous for an equipment failure. Cuck felt the walls closing in again. Sarah, how much did you pay them, Bobby's family, to disappear? The number came out before he could stop it. $500,000, plus ongoing medical coverage for the boy. Jesus, Sarah finally turned back to him. You've been paying Tyler's family for 30 years, supporting the son of the man you murdered. It sounded even worse when she said it out loud. Cuck had told himself the payments were guilt, penance, a way to honor Bobby's memory. But hearing it described in Sarah's flat professional tone made it sound like what it really was. Evidence of premeditation. A sharp knock interrupted them. Cuck, we've got a problem. Frank's voice carried through the door, steady but strained. Sarah moved to open it before Cuck could react. Frank stood in the doorway, his earlier shock replaced by something harder. Behind him, Cuck could see most of the crew had gathered near the craft services table, their nervous energy crystallized into something that looked dangerously like mutiny. What now? Chuck asked. Tyler's been talking to the crew, asking questions about the old days, your early films. Danny mentioned that his kid wants to be a stuntman, and Tyler got very interested in safety protocols. Started telling stories about equipment failures in the 90s. Chuck's stomach dropped. Stories? Nothing specific. Yet. Frank stepped into the trailer, closing the door behind him. But he's planting seeds, Chuck, making people think about accidents that maybe weren't accidents. The three of them stood in the confined space, decades of shared history suddenly feeling fragile. Frank had been directing action sequences when Chuck was still doing dinner theater. Sarah had turned down offers from major studios to stay with Harrison Entertainment. They were his inner circle, the people who'd helped him build something that mattered. I need to know what we're dealing with, Frank continued, because that boy out there isn't just some entitled actor throwing a tantrum. He's got an agenda, and he's smart enough to execute it. Chuck looked between his two most trusted collaborators, seeing his own doom reflected in their eyes. Sarah knew the truth now. Frank suspected enough to be dangerous, and somewhere outside, Tyler was systematically poisoning the well of loyalty Chuck had spent 3 decades digging. It's about Bobby Castellano, Sarah said quietly. Frank went very still. Bobby? Christ, Chuck, that was 30 years ago. Equipment failure, tragic accident. Was it? Sarah's tone was carefully neutral, but Chuck caught the challenge underneath. Frank looked between them, his weathered face creasing with confusion that slowly morphed into something else. Understanding, horror, the same expression Chuck had seen in the mirror an hour ago. Oh, fuck, Frank whispered. Tyler's Bobby's boy. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Outside, Chuck could hear normal film set sounds, equipment moving, voices calling directions, the controlled chaos of creation. Inside his trailer, everything that mattered was falling apart. He wants everything, Chuck said finally. My reputation, my company, my relationships. He wants to watch me lose it all. Then we don't let him, Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah was already shaking her head. You can't fight video evidence. And if Tyler's been planning this for 15 years, he's got more than just that security footage. Chuck's phone buzzed again. Another text, Act 1 complete. Ready for Act 2? Tyler. Through the window, he could see the young man standing near the craft services table, surrounded by crew members who hung on his every word. Tyler caught Chuck's eye through the glass and smiled, raising an imaginary glass in a mock toast. Chuck's old life was officially over. The only question now was how much collateral damage Tyler would leave in his wake. Chuck watched Tyler's mock toast through the trailer window, and something inside him snapped. Not toward violence, he'd never been physically brave, but toward a desperate kind of honesty he hadn't accessed in 30 years. I need to tell you both exactly what happened that night, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. All of it. Sarah and Frank exchanged glances. Frank settled heavily into the chair across from Chuck's desk, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. Sarah remained standing, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. October 15th, 1994. We were behind schedule, over budget. The warehouse sequence was supposed to be my big breakout moment, the shot that would prove I could handle major action franchises. Chuck's hands found the scattered script pages, gathering them into a neat pile, busy work to avoid their eyes. I'd been doing smaller stunts throughout filming, building my reputation. But that 50-foot fall... He could still remember standing on that platform, looking down at the airbags that seemed impossibly small from that height. The safety coordinator explaining the rigging, the backup cables, the multiple redundancies that made the stunt routine. Industry standard. I froze, Chuck continued. Not just nervous, completely paralyzed, couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare down at what looked like my own death. Frank's face was carefully neutral, but Chuck caught the flicker of understanding. Every action director had seen actors hit that wall, the moment when bravado met physics and lost. Bobby found me up there an hour later, said he'd run the cables, checked every connection twice. The kid was always like that, obsessively careful, methodical. He never took unnecessary risks. Chuck's voice caught. He asked if I wanted him to do the fall instead. Just for tonight, just to keep us on schedule. Nobody would ever have to know. Sarah's posture shifted slightly, her professional mask slipping enough to show something that might have been sympathy. You let him. I should have said yes and dealt with the humiliation. But I was 28 years old and terrified that admitting fear would end my career before it started, so I told Bobby I just needed another hour to prepare. The confession felt like bleeding. Chuck had never spoken these words aloud, had barely allowed himself to think them in coherent sentences. They'd lived in his chest like shrapnel for 3 decades, working deeper with each passing year. I climbed down and sent Bobby to craft services. Told everyone I was doing actor preparation, needed the set clear for concentration. Then I went to the rigging. Frank leaned forward. Chuck. I didn't cut the cables clean through. I'm not stupid, and I wasn't planning murder. I just weakened them, created stress points that would hold for an initial safety check but might fail under repeated use. Chuck forced himself to look up to meet their eyes. I thought if they failed during my run, maybe I'd get injured enough to justify using a double for the remainder of filming. A broken arm, some bruised ribs, enough damage to preserve my pride. The trailer was silent, except for the distant sounds of film production continuing outside their bubble of confession. Sarah had gone very still, processing implications with the same analytical intensity she brought to production problems. But Bobby came back early, she said. Studio executives showed up unannounced, wanted to see dailies, check on our progress. Bobby volunteered to run the sequence one final time before I did my take, make sure everything was perfect. Chuck's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The cables held for his safety check, held for his first practice run, failed on the second. Frank's weathered hands covered his face. Jesus Christ, Chuck. I watched him fall. Watched the man who'd spent 2 years keeping me alive hit that concrete floor because I was too much of a coward to admit I was scared. Chuck stood abruptly, moving to the window where Tyler was still entertaining the crew. The studio called it equipment failure, faulty manufacturing, metal fatigue, one of those tragic accidents that happen in action filmmaking. I never corrected them. Sarah's voice was carefully controlled. And the family? Bobby had a wife and a 7-year-old son. The studio offered standard compensation, but I couldn't let that be the end of it. I set up a trust fund, ongoing medical coverage, education expenses, anonymous through a shell company. I told myself it was penance. It was guilt money, Frank said bluntly. It was blood money, Chuck corrected. And somehow, Bobby's son figured out where it was coming from. Through the window, he watched Tyler demonstrate something to Danny Martinez, a movement that looked disturbingly familiar. The easy confidence, the precise gestures, the way he held the attention of everyone around him. Bobby had possessed that same natural charisma, the kind of presence that made people want to follow him into dangerous places. He's been planning this for years, Chuck continued. Getting into the industry, building credentials, waiting for the perfect moment. And now he's here, and he's going to destroy everything Bobby died for. The irony was devastating. Chuck had built Harrison Entertainment on the foundation of Bobby's death, but he tried to build something worthy, a company that treated its people fairly, that prioritized safety, that honored the collaborative nature of filmmaking. Everything Bobby would have wanted. Tyler was going to tear it all down to satisfy the rage of a 7-year-old boy who'd lost his father. The silence that followed Chuck's confession felt like a tomb. Sarah moved first, walking to his desk and opening the laptop he'd closed. The video file was still there, waiting like a loaded gun. "Play it again," she said. "Sarah, play it." Her voice had taken on the steely authority Chuck had learned to respect over their years of partnership. "I need to see exactly what we're dealing with." Chuck reluctantly clicked play. The grainy security footage rolled again, timestamp glowing, 11:47 p.m. But this time, Sarah leaned closer, studying details Chuck had been too horrified to notice during his first viewing. "Stop," she said suddenly. "Go back 30 seconds. Chuck rewound the footage. On screen, his younger self climbed the rigging with wire cutters, movements frantic and desperate. "There," Sarah pointed at the timestamp. "Look at the date." Chuck squinted at the corner of the screen. October 14th, 1994. His blood turned cold. That's the wrong date." Bobby died on the 15th, Frank said slowly. You just told us. I know what I told you. Chuck's mind raced, pulling up memories he'd spent 30 years trying to bury. The studio executive visit, Bobby's volunteer run, the cables failing. That was October 15th. This footage is from the day before. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, checking the video file's metadata. This was recorded October 14th at 11:47 p.m., 24 hours before Bobby's accident. The revelation hit Chuck like physical blow. He stared at the screen, watching himself sabotage rigging that couldn't have killed Bobby Castellano, because Bobby had died on different rigging entirely. The cables he'd weakened were for a completely different sequence. I didn't kill him, Chuck whispered. Frank stood up abruptly. What the hell are you saying? The warehouse had multiple stunt setups. We were shooting out of sequence, had 3 different rigs installed for different scenes. Chuck's voice grew stronger as the memory solidified. This footage shows me sabotaging the rigging for the helicopter chase sequence. Bobby died on the prison break rig. Sarah was already pulling up production files on her tablet, cross-referencing shooting schedules with her characteristic efficiency. Chuck's right. October 14th was the helicopter unit. October 15th was the warehouse interior, completely different setup. The weight Chuck had carried for 30 years began to shift, not disappearing but changing shape. He hadn't killed Bobby, but he'd still sabotaged equipment, still put people in danger, still chosen cowardice over courage. Then how did Bobby die? Frank asked. Chuck closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember that night clearly for the first time in 3 decades. Without the filter of guilt, the details came flooding back. Actual equipment failure, real metal fatigue in a cable that had been in service too long. The studio investigation was legitimate. Bobby died because of cost-cutting on maintenance, not because of anything I did. But you've spent 30 years thinking you murdered him, Sarah said quietly. I would have. If he'd used the rig I sabotaged, I would have killed him. Chuck opened his eyes, meeting their stares. The intent was there. The willingness to put someone else at risk to save my own reputation. Frank shook his head slowly. You've been paying guilt money for a crime you didn't commit. Another text buzzed on Chuck's phone. How's the viewing party going? Tyler. Chuck stared at the message, understanding flooding through him like ice water. Tyler had timed everything perfectly. The public humiliation, the private revelation, the devastating video evidence. But Tyler believed the same lie Chuck had believed for 30 years. He doesn't know, Chuck said aloud. Know what? Sarah asked. Tyler thinks this footage proves I killed his father. He spent years, maybe decades, gathering evidence for a murder that never happened. Chuck felt something between horror and pity. That 7-year-old boy grew up believing his father's death wasn't an accident, and somehow he traced the anonymous payments back to me. He put together a completely logical theory based on completely wrong information. Sarah was reading something on her tablet, her expression grim. Chuck, there's more. Tyler Kane isn't Bobby's real son. What? I've been running background checks since he walked on set. Tyler Kane is 28 years old, born Tyler Castellano in Phoenix, Arizona. But Bobby's son was named Michael, and he'd be 37 now, not 28. Sarah looked up from her screen. Tyler is Bobby's nephew, Bobby's younger brother's kid. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Tyler hadn't grown up with grief. He'd grown up with family stories, whispered theories, second-hand rage passed down like a poisonous inheritance. He'd built his entire identity around avenging a murder that existed only in his imagination. He's wrong about everything, Frank said wonderfully. The timeline, the victim, the crime itself. Chuck felt no relief. If anything, the truth made Tyler more dangerous. You could negotiate with greed, even with justified vengeance. But delusion armed with partial evidence was unstoppable. His phone buzzed again, ready for the finale. The whole world is about to know what kind of man Chuck Harrison really is. Chuck stared at Tyler's latest message, the words blurring as 30 years of misplaced guilt crystallized into something harder. Outside, he could hear Tyler's voice carrying across the set, still weaving his web of half-truths and family mythology. We have to stop him, Sarah said. but her tone suggested she already knew the impossibility of that task. With what? Chuck pocketed his phone. The truth? Tyler's not interested in the truth. He's interested in the story he's been telling himself since he was a kid. Frank moved to the window, watching as Tyler demonstrated what looked like a fighting sequence to an increasingly captivated audience. He's got charisma, I'll give him that. Reminds me of Bobby, Chuck finished. Yeah, I noticed. The observation hung heavy between them. Tyler had inherited more than just his uncle's name and grievances. He'd inherited that magnetic quality that made people want to believe whatever he was selling. It's what had made Bobby such an effective stunt coordinator, and it's what was making Tyler such a dangerous enemy. Sarah's tablet chimed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. It's Marcus Webb from Variety. Chuck's stomach dropped. Marcus had been covering Hollywood for 25 years, long enough to remember Bobby's death, smart enough to connect dots when they were presented clearly. If Tyler was ready to go public, Marcus would be the perfect vehicle, respected, connected, and hungry for the kind of story that could define a career. Don't answer it, Frank said quickly. He'll just call back. And if Tyler's already talked to him... Sarah let the implication hang. Chuck's mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. Tyler had spent years preparing for this moment. He wouldn't have moved without ensuring maximum damage. A respected journalist, video evidence, a compelling narrative of cover-ups and corruption. It was a perfect storm. Answer it, Chuck said finally. Put it on speaker. Sarah hesitated, then swiped to accept the call. Marcus, what can I do for you? Marcus Webb's gravelly voice filled the trailer, tinged with the excitement of a man who'd stumbled onto something big. Sarah, I need to talk to Chuck. I've got a source making some serious allegations about Harrison Entertainment, about something that happened in 1994. The three of them exchanged glances. Frank's weathered face had gone ashen, while Sarah maintained her professional mask despite the tension radiating from her shoulders. Chuck's in meetings all afternoon, Sarah said smoothly. Can I ask what this is regarding? The death of Bobby Castellano. I've got someone claiming Chuck Harrison sabotaged equipment to cover up his own cowardice, then covered it up for 30 years. They've got video evidence. Chuck closed his eyes, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed world crumble in real time. Tyler's version of events was about to become the official narrative, and no amount of protestation would matter once it hit print. The industry ran on reputation and trust, and both were about to evaporate. I'll need Chuck to respond by 6 p.m., Marcus continued. The story runs tomorrow morning either way. Sarah's knuckles were white around the phone. That's not much time, Marcus. It's more than most people get. Chuck Harrison's been a pillar of this community for 3 decades. I owe him a chance to tell his side. Marcus paused. But Sarah? If these allegations are true, if Chuck's been living a lie all these years, this is going to be bigger than just one man's career. This is about the entire culture of silence around on-set safety. The call ended, leaving them in a silence that felt like a funeral. Through the window, Chuck could see Tyler still holding court, his animated gestures painting pictures of heroism and injustice for his rapt audience. Several crew members were filming him with their phones now, creating a viral moment in real time. 4 hours, Frank said quietly. That's all we have. Chuck felt something shift inside him, the last vestiges of fear burning away to reveal something he hadn't felt in decades: clarity. Tyler had built his entire identity around a lie, had weaponized family grief into personal vendetta, had chosen destruction over understanding, but most damning of all, he was about to drag down innocent people. The cast, the crew, the partners who'd built Harrison Entertainment into something that mattered. No, Chuck said, standing with more conviction than he'd felt in years. Tyler gets 4 hours, then this ends. Sarah looked up from her tablet, where she'd been frantically typing notes. What are you thinking? Chuck moved to the trailer door, his hand on the handle. Outside, Tyler was winding up for what looked like a grand finale, his audience hanging on every word. The young man caught Chuck's eye through the glass and smiled, that same confident grin Bobby had worn when explaining a particularly complex stunt sequence. But Tyler wasn't Bobby. Bobby had been careful, methodical, interested in building rather than destroying. Tyler was something else entirely, a ghost made flesh, armed with just enough truth to be lethal. "I'm thinking it's time for the real finale," Cuck said, and stepped outside to face the man who'd come to destroy him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the set as Cuck stepped into the circle of crew members surrounding Tyler. Conversations died mid-sentence, phones lowered, and the electric energy of gossip transformed into something heavier, the anticipation of witnessing either vindication or destruction. Tyler's smile widened as Cuck approached, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "Cuck, perfect timing. I was just telling everyone about the old days, about how things used to be done in Hollywood." "Were you?" Chuck's voice carried across the sudden quiet with the authority of 3 decades in the industry. "And what exactly were you telling them, Tyler?" The young actor's posture straightened, feeding off the attention like a performer hitting his mark. The truth, about how legends are really made, about the prices other people pay for someone else's glory. Cuck felt the weight of every eye on set. Crew members who'd worked with him for years, actors who'd trusted him with their careers, professionals who'd built their livelihoods on the foundation of Harrison Entertainment. They deserved better than becoming collateral damage in Tyler's war against ghosts. "The truth," Cuck repeated slowly. "That's interesting, because I've spent the last hour learning some truths myself." Something flickered across Tyler's face, uncertainty, quickly masked, but not quickly enough. He'd prepared for denial, for legal threats, for the standard Hollywood damage control playbook. He hadn't prepared for Cuck to lean into the confrontation. "Bobby Castellano was a good man," Cuck continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the assembled group. "He was careful, methodical, and he cared more about keeping people safe than about getting the perfect shot. He died on October 15, 1994, when a cable failed due to metal fatigue and inadequate maintenance protocols." Tyler's confident mask began to slip. "You're lying." "Am I? Because the video you sent me shows October 14th. Different day, Tyler. Different rig. Different sequence entirely." Cuck stepped closer, close enough to see the confusion warring with fury in Tyler's eyes. "Bobby died on rigging I never touched, in an accident that had nothing to do with me." The crowd murmured, phones rising again as the confrontation took an unexpected turn. Frank and Sarah had emerged from the trailer, positioning themselves where they could intervene if necessary, but Cuck felt strangely calm. For the first time in 30 years, he was fighting with the truth as his weapon. "That's impossible," Tyler said, but his voice had lost its theatrical confidence. "The payments, the anonymous trust fund, you've been paying guilt money for 30 years. "I've been paying guilt money," Cuck agreed, "but not for killing your uncle, for the intent to put him in danger, for choosing cowardice over courage, for sabotaging equipment because I was too scared to admit I was human." Tyler's face had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. "You're trying to rewrite history." "No, Tyler, I'm trying to understand it. Something you might have tried before building your entire identity around a lie." Chuck's voice softened slightly, finding genuine compassion beneath his anger. "Bobby was your hero, I understand that. And when he died, your family needed someone to blame besides random chance and corporate negligence. I was convenient. You killed him." The words echoed across the set with the desperation of a man watching his foundational beliefs crumble. Several crew members stepped back, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or breakdown. Cuck pulled out his phone, fingers moving with deliberate precision. "Marcus Webb from Variety called 20 minutes ago. You gave him quite a story. Unfortunately for both of you, it's the wrong story. The evidence shows me sabotaging rigging that was used for the helicopter sequence, not the warehouse interior where Bobby died. Shows me committing a crime that endangered people but didn't kill anyone. Shows me being a coward and a fool, but not a murderer." Tyler was shaking now, 30 years of carefully constructed hatred colliding with reality. "The family stories, my father said. Your father was 7 years old when Bobby died. Children create narratives to make sense of senseless loss. Adults are supposed to verify those narratives before weaponizing them. Chuck hit send on the message he'd composed to Marcus Webb, copying Sarah and the studio's legal team. The truth, all of it. The sabotage, the guilt, the misplaced payments, and most importantly, the timeline that exonerated him of the crime Tyler believed he'd committed. "You want to destroy me over something that never happened," Chuck continued. "You want to tear down everything Bobby died for. Safety protocols, fair treatment, the collaborative spirit he believed in, to satisfy the rage of a child who lost his hero." Tyler's hands clenched into fists, but the fight was draining out of him. Without his righteous certainty, he was just a young actor whose entire identity had been built on a foundation of family mythology and second-hand grief. "Bobby deserved better than this," Chuck said quietly. "He deserved better than dying for corporate cost-cutting, and he deserved better than having his name used to destroy the very things he tried to build." The silence that followed stretched like a held breath across the entire set. Tyler stood frozen, his carefully constructed world of righteous vengeance collapsing around him like a demolished building. Chuck watched the young man's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally something that looked almost like grief, not for Bobby, but for the version of himself that had defined his entire adult life. "I don't," Tyler's voice cracked. "Everything I thought, everything I planned, was built on a story that made sense to a frightened child," Chuck said gently. "But you're not a child anymore, Tyler, and Bobby's death, the real story, is tragic enough without turning it into something it wasn't." The crew began to disperse slowly, conversations resuming in hushed tones, as the drama deflated into something more human and fragile. Chuck felt the familiar weight of leadership settling back onto his shoulders, the responsibility for all these people who trusted him with their careers and their safety. Marcus Webb called back 20 minutes later. Chuck took it privately this time, explaining the timeline discrepancies and offering full access to the production records from 1994. The journalist's excitement cooled into professional skepticism, then grudging acceptance as the evidence mounted against Tyler's version of events. The story would still run, but it would be about family mythology and misplaced guilt rather than murder and cover-ups. Tyler left the set that evening without saying goodbye to anyone. Chuck watched him drive away in a rental car that looked too small for all the collapsed dreams it carried, and felt the particular sadness that came from watching someone discover that their entire identity had been built on quicksand. Frank found Chuck in his trailer 2 hours later, staring at the wall where a photo of the original crew from that 1994 production hung. Bobby's smile bright and confident in the center of the group shot. "How do you feel?" the old director asked, settling heavily into the chair across from Chuck's desk. "Different," Chuck said after a long moment. 30 years I've been carrying around this weight, and now it's not gone. I still sabotage that equipment. I still chose my reputation over people's safety, but it's lighter somehow, more honest." Frank nodded slowly. "The guilt was easier when it was absolute. Now you have to live with being human instead of being a monster." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the lot, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. Outside, the crew was wrapping for the day with the efficient choreography of professionals who trusted each other completely. The kind of collaborative spirit Bobby had believed in, that had somehow survived despite everything. Sarah knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a habit Chuck had long since stopped trying to discourage. She carried a tablet displaying Marcus Webb's article, scheduled to publish in the morning edition. "It's fair," she said simply. "He presents Tyler's story, then the evidence that contradicts it. Makes you look human instead of heroic, but human is better than what you were expecting." Chuck read the headline, "The Burden of False Guilt, How Family Mythology Can Outlive Truth in Hollywood's Safety Culture." It wasn't the takedown Tyler had orchestrated, but it wasn't the whitewash Chuck might have hoped for either. It was messy and complicated and true. "What about Tyler?" Frank asked. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "His agent dropped him this afternoon. Word travels fast in this town, but he's young, and he's talented when he's not carrying 30 years of someone else's anger. Someone will take a chance on him eventually." Chuck hoped that was true. Tyler reminded him too much of Bobby. That same intensity, that same magnetic quality that drew people in. With proper guidance and a healthier relationship with the truth, he might actually become the kind of actor his uncle would have been proud to work with. The following weeks brought a strange kind of peace. The scandal flickered through industry news for a few days before being replaced by fresher gossip. The anonymous trust fund payments stopped, but Cuck established a named scholarship in Bobby's memory for stunt safety training. It felt better than guilt money, more honest, more useful. Tyler sent a single text message 6 weeks later. "I'm sorry. For all of it." Cuck stared at those 7 words for a long time before responding, "Bobby would have forgiven you. Learn to forgive yourself." The final day of production arrived with the October light that reminded Cuck so vividly of that night 30 years ago. But this time, watching Frank direct the last scene with the meticulous care that had made him legendary, Cuck felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 decades, the simple satisfaction of work well done, stories honestly told, and the knowledge that everyone would go home safe. Some guilt, Cuck realized, was worth carrying, not as punishment but as reminder. The weight of responsibility, properly understood, wasn't burden but ballast. It kept you steady when the storms came, and ensured you never forgot the cost of the choices you made. Standing in the fading light, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a rap party beginning to form, Cuck Harrison finally felt like the man he'd spent 30 years pretending to be.